Go ahead and get started. Welcome to the Geospatial Forum. For those of you that do not know me, my name is Mirela Tulpre and I'm a professor here at the Center for Geospatial Analytics. And today it is my great pleasure to introduce our forum speaker, Dr. Sparkle Malone, who is an assistant professor at the School of the Environment. Prior to Yale, Dr. Malone was an assistant professor at Florida International University in Miami, where she built the Malone Disturbance Ecology Lab. And prior to that, she was with USDA Forest Service at the Rocky Mountain Research Station. In her research, she uses remote sensing and eddy covariance data and models to understand how ecosystems respond to climate variability and disturbances. And on a personal note, I've known Dr. Malone since 2015, when we both attended a summer school with NCIS, the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis at the University of California in Santa Barbara. We were part of the same group, and we worked on a group project together, and we even published the results of that project, which looked at the impact of the California droughts on the ecosystem structure and function, and it was a great collaboration. So I'm really excited to host Dr. Malone today. So welcome, and please join me in welcoming Dr. Malone to our forum.
So first, I would just like to say thank you so much for having me. I'm so honored to be invited here and to get to spend some time with you all, share with you all some of the choices I made in my career, and share with you some of the research that I'm doing and directions that I think some of this work is going in. And so following the theme for your forum, we're going to start with talking about just how I develop my geospatial perspective, the role of geospatial perspectives in this idea of net zero, and questioning how we're doing some carbon accounting, and then thinking a little bit about the future and what might be some directions that geospatial work will go in order to address some of the biggest challenges that we're all going to face. And so a lot of my work from the very beginning has really focused on trying to understand what's going on with ecosystems. We do that in a number of approaches, and these approaches are really all based on data limitations. The fact that we can't measure everything everywhere all the time, and even if we couldn't even ingest that information and do something with it. And so we oftentimes have to design studies in a way to figure out what's happening now, what happened in the past, or what happened in the future by doing either a space for time substitution or even a time for time substitution. And with these space for time substitutions, we take measurements in different locations, and then understanding differences in age, growth rates, and conditions, we think we have detected patterns, and then we can project those patterns in space or over time to understand how things might change. And we'll use that information to make decisions. When it comes for the time for time substitutions, we essentially choose locations that we're going to measure over long time periods, and we make assumptions about whatever relationships that we detect temporally. We should expect those same patterns to dominate spatially, and then we project it in space and we say, hey, we learned something. And all my research is about these two things, taking one of these approaches depending on what is available and using that to understand what's happening in space, what's happening in time, or if I'm feeling really brave, what's going to happen in the future. And so, like you all, I started my career during my undergraduate, and at that time I was at the University of Florida for, well, some discussions that I've had with a small subset of you. You know that my parents gave me one goal. They were like, get through college and do not have any debt. And don't cost us any money, and it'll be great. You'll have a good future. And so I went to the University of Florida. I was really interested in environmental sciences. And so I had to decide, how was I going to pull off this training in environmental sciences without it costing me any money, because I didn't have any. And then how was I just going to prepare for my career? And so I looked around at all the options. There's a lot of different departments you can go into if you're interested in the environmental sciences, but the forestry department needed me bad. And so I went to the forestry department. They had a lot of opportunities and provided a lot of support for students that were interested in a number of different environmental sciences, and they had good scholarships. And so we had a very strong relationship with each other. The forestry department, you know, that kind of work is very applied. And it really had a lasting impact on my career, which I think definitely for the better, but it made me think about what are land managers doing and what are their challenges. One of the first research projects that I got involved in, so I guess first I should tell you that one thing that I'm kind of known for is taking on too many commitments. And this problem developed, like I've always been like this. And so when I was a student, I was registered for more classes than I could technically attend. And for one of those classes, I wanted to take this geospatial class, and I could only attend the class 1 day a week, even though it meant 3 days a week. But I had conflicting classes on the other days. And I really wanted to take it for a very specific reason that I could get the 1 day a week that I was available. And so I got a deal with Scott Smith. And I was like, look, I just want to attend this class for this one reason. Would you let me do it? And he was like, yeah, for sure. But in exchange for you missing a third of the classes, you're going to work on this project. And I was like, okay, I'm Spark Malone. I take on too much work. I'll do it. And so they were developing this hurricane tool that was supposed to be able to detect downwood in urban areas. And this was really important because they needed it for resource management. Because as you saw with this last stream of hurricanes that come through, you have to be able to move material really quickly after a storm to ensure it's not still on the ground for the next one. And so they were developing this tool, and it was my job to figure out how well the tool worked, determine what kind of errors were being detected. And so this tool is just looking for down trees. It's trying to detect logs, and then it's trying to estimate how much biomass that is, which neighborhoods it's going to be in, so that the city can then do the planning, pick it up and get it out of there. And so it was my job to look through all of these images and to find the down trees first. I was the original tool. I found all the down trees, and then I had to do the evaluation of how well did this product work, what are some of the errors, and I just went back and forth with the people in computer science until it was good enough. And so this was my first awakening in the geospatial realm. It wasn't actually on purpose-esque. I was taking spatial classes because I knew it was important for natural resource management, but I actually didn't think I was gonna live in the spatial realm until this project, and I really liked it. I really liked the idea that we were tying information that we were learning about a location, about an urban area, about an event, and we knew exactly where it was happening. And I thought, wow, that is important. Like, you can't just know these relationships generally. You need to be able to know where it's happening, when it happened, and to follow them over time. And so I was sold after this project that I only got because I had committed to way too many things. Do not take 26 credits in a semester. It's dumb. Okay, that was a big mistake, but a lot of the things still came out of it. I love this project, and it really, one, sold me on research, because before I didn't even know that research existed. And I didn't know you could have a career in research. And I was like, oh, I was in a room working on this project with a bunch of postdocs, and I was like, they are living their best life. I want to live that life. And so I started going crazy, getting on research projects that were being offered in the school, and it was definitely worth it. I tried a whole bunch of things. It was great. During the time I was an undergraduate, I also spent each summer interning with the Forest Service. And I did this because even though I knew I wanted to work in the environmental sciences, I don't know why I wanted to work in the environmental sciences, but I was into it. But I didn't know what the career prospects were. And so I had to do quite a bit of work to figure out, well, if I'm an environmental scientist, what kind of jobs would be open to me and what would it be like to live those jobs? And so every summer, I would intern with the Forest Service doing something completely different because I'd never landed on anything that I really wanted to do. My first summer, I worked with a forester and a fisheries biologist. The forester was cool and all. We were measuring trees, and I was like, this is cool. I love the crews that will go out and mark trees to be cut down. And so I was like, this is great. I like it. Do I want to do it for the rest of my life? Definitely not. But it was cool and I was feeling it. I did some work with a fisheries biologist, which was also cool sometimes, was really questionable. On my first day, I remember like we were sampling this little pond. And they were like, well, get in the water. And I was like, okay, I'm Sparkle, I'm open. Put on my waders, I got in the water and we're doing all this stuff. And then an alligator popped out. I was like, you have me in this water and there was an alligator could eat me, I'm little. Shocking fish, seeing what was there. It was cool, but I felt like that's not me. Because I can't spend my life in waders. It's really hot, it's sweaty in there. And the sampling animals, it wasn't my thing. I have much respect for the people who do it. But I learned a lot and it was really cool and I had a lot of fun. What I started to do though was I noticed these natural resource managers, they kind of make a lot of decisions, and some of them, it's really interesting that sometimes they're making decisions on vibes and sometimes they're making decisions trying to use data, but in the olden days, it wasn't that easy to gather all this information, and it wasn't that easy to be aware of all the things that you could do with all these remote sensing products. But in one of my internships, I was working with the Forest Service, and I was in their GIS lab, and they were trying to figure out how to develop this adaptive management model for fire. And so what they wanted to know was how to build a schedule to prioritize areas to burn. And so the way that they had been recording fires, at that time, they were recording the fire perimeters, and they would keep information about those fires in those shapefiles, and that's what they had to go on. But what they started to notice when they try to make these prioritization models was that it didn't always line up with reality. If you went out to a location and your model projected that that location had burned last year, sometimes you went out there and you were like, there's no way. All this vegetation came back in less than a year, so clearly it didn't burn. And so there were some limitations to recording information in fire perimeters. And so in those days, I thought, well, you know what, we should probably use remote sensing products. So that, yes, all the Forest Service is gonna do is what they have the resources to do, which is record these perimeters. But then for each perimeter, we can go in and we can calculate the burn severity so that we can detect which areas actually burn and which ones don't burn, and then the severity that they are burning. And that would help us better understand how to make these how to prioritize prescribed burns in the Southeast. And so that's what I did. I went back after my summer internship and I was like, hey, University of Florida, how about you let me switch to a master's instead of finishing my undergraduate degree? And then in those days, they had the 4+1 program. And so they were like, take the GRE and you're in. And I did. I took the GRE and I switched to a master's project where I then used the rest of my time to start shaking down the different Forest Service regions and say, send me all your shape files for your fires. And I made all these fire history layers. And then for every single fire that had occurred, I went in and pulled Landsat and calculated different normalized burn ratios for each of the fires so that when we made these prioritization tools, it would be based on the amount of change that actually occurred within the fire perimeters, which was really great and really fun, and was a little bit before the MTBS time, before they made all of these layers available to everyone. And so I had to go make them myself, and I was a little salty when that came out, but it made it easier for everyone else, so I looked the other way. But this work was really interesting and really sold me on the idea that you can have a pretty good career doing this data science thing where you're using all these different types of information that's available and you're bringing them and integrating them together to make models to help understand how systems are performing and how you would expect them to perform in the future. With this work, I focused on estimating the probability of high severity fire because that's what was the objective of a lot of the fire programs, was to keep the burning good enough so that when areas did burn, they didn't burn at high severity. And so this was really my first take on designing a project that was completely based on my own ideas of what I thought the land managers needed, even though I was so bold to think that I could come up with something so great, but it really worked out because I had a lot of feedback from the land managers on what they were interested in, how they were making decisions, and I tried to come up with an approach that was realistic. And so that's the work that we did. When we did these projections, I did it for Osceola National Forest, mostly because their fire record was most appropriate and because it was closest to the university. And so when I had to drive out there and do some checks, I could do it in a reasonable amount of time. And so it was a great place to develop this adaptive management tool and to be able to collect data for the validation. Following my undergraduate and master's work, which was really focused on doing things in space, I realized I feel like for that time I had the space thing down pat, the GIS, I was in it. It was great, but for my PhD, I wanted to really focus on understanding temporal dynamics. And I thought, what better way to do that than to work with one of the worst data sets ever? Flux data. That data is collected at really high resolutions. It's really challenging to do the calculations. And like I said, I like to take on problems that are pretty ridiculous. And so I focused my PhD work looking at measurements of fluxes of CO2 and gases between the ecosystem and the atmosphere. And I did this in the Everglades, where there was a network of towers that were representative of these different ecosystem types. And I could use this to understand carbon, water, and energy dynamics in these ecosystems to explain why their carbon budgets were so different. And so when you look at these images, you can see that there are some of these areas within the wetlands that have a lot of emergent high density vegetation, some areas that the vegetation is really emergent, but at pretty low density. So I was really just trying to figure out why is that? And so looking at these two different tower sites, I can do a comparison of ecosystems that have differences in hydrology and what it means for its carbon dynamics to kind of back out the role of hydrology and influencing carbon. And I use a number of different studies to kind of work out what the carbon budget was of these ecosystems and how we should expect it to change with differences in hydrology. This work was super interesting, super difficult, mostly because of the sheer amount of information that can be collected in a single time series, but it really set the stage for understanding the connection between temporal and spatial dynamics, because as I learned more and more about these systems, I was able to think about how I can create spatially representative models that should be more conditioned to capture the spatial variability that exists within these ecosystems. I also worked because, like I said, sometimes I get a little bold and I'm like, you know what, I don't just want to know what's happening now. I often also want to know what's going to happen in the future. And so all of the temporal patterns that I was learning about these ecosystems, I use the DACENT model to then either keep those patterns consistent or change them in varying degrees to say, what does the carbon future look like for these different ecosystems? And so under current conditions, they're about CO2 neutral, but any shifts in hydrological patterns will push these systems in one direction or another. If they get too dry, they'll lose all their carbon. It'll just make its way into the atmosphere. But if they're too wet, they lose their capacity to take up more carbon, but they're just holding on to the carbon that they do have. And so I was able to play around with making all these different possible futures to understand what's the risk of actually losing carbon in these landscapes where they are highly dependent on hydrology. And we actually completely control the hydrology in the Everglades. And so it was definitely interesting work. I also couldn't get everything I needed just from in situ studies. And so of course, I'm Spark Malone, I was gonna run a greenhouse study at the same time as doing all of these temporal analyses so that I can force things to happen so that I knew what the responses would be like. And so here, during the time that I was taking tower measurements in the Everglades, no droughts had occurred, and I really wanted one. And so since no droughts occurred naturally, I decided, oh, I'll make my own drought. And so I went down to the Everglades, harvested a bunch of monoliths from area that was very adjacent to the national park. And the area was owned by this cement company and they did not care what you did. So I was like, how about you let me on your property? I'm gonna cut out whole monoliths of ecosystems and I'm gonna take them back to Alabama and do some things to them. And they were on board and they let me do this for years. And there were pretty large areas that I was cutting out and removing their whole ecosystem. And so I was like, oh, it's a good thing they don't care. And so I took all of these monoliths back to the University of Alabama and I ran a drought study so that I can figure out, well, what happens to the carbon dynamics? And I knew, like, unlike the in situ studies where we were like overwhelmingly focused on CO2 dynamics, when it came to drought, I knew that like I needed to capture more of the methane if I was really gonna understand the carbon story of these systems. And so I did these chamber studies alongside the drought experiment to understand how the balance between CO2 emissions and methane emissions changes as you have these droughts and what does it mean for the future, which was really handy, especially when I needed to have these events be representative in my climate change models. And so I learned a lot, mostly that, yeah, the carbon dynamics does completely change. It's definitely aligned with what we were seeing in these ecosystems during the dry seasons. And it would completely change the carbon story if these systems were to be drained again. Not only because they wouldn't take up as much CO2, but because they actually would emit a lot less methane at the same time. And so it was a really interesting time, but it also showed me like the value of making something happen if it didn't happen during the time frame that you needed it to happen. So you could play God, you could do anything. Another thing that was really important for these ecosystems was to think about these large-scale climate teleconnections. And so even though most of the time when we think about El Nino and La Nina, we're thinking about West Coast shenanigans, things that are going down. But in Florida, those cycles have a pretty huge impact on how much precipitation is going to occur. And because the South Florida region and the Everglades flowway in general is reliant on all this water that's coming into the entire state, these climate patterns really dictate how much precipitation you're gonna get. And this is why I didn't have a drought during my time. Because it wasn't a strong enough La Nina that occurred during my PhD, and my PhD was only 3 years, and so I just needed more time. But I was able to detect what happens, how much of these climate teleconnections are really driving what we see in terms of carbon dynamics, and how to represent that if we're gonna make these landscape models. And so this is directly tied to the same ideas of hydrology is everything in this system. And any of these climate patterns that result in longer or shorter dry downs will completely change the carbon patterns of these systems. And so we have to take this into consideration as well when we're studying these wetland ecosystems in South Florida. And so all of that went into my PhD work, which was a ton of fun. Time went by really fast. And then I moved on to work for the Forest Service. And so I decided to work for the Forest Service, one, because I thought I was equipped to work for an agency that was focused on natural resource management. And that was also focus on trying to develop adaptive management solutions using as much information as possible to make decisions. And so being in a research position, I went a little crazy. I was like, I work everywhere. And I did. I started working on drought because I like drought. And during that time, the droughts were happening on the West Coast. I look at changes in species range shifts because I was in the Rocky Mountains, like everyone would do that. I looked at wildfire recovery because, you know, my history of fire, I can't let go of things. Once I pick them up, I just keep them going with me. And then looking at productivity trends, looking at anthropogenic impacts, and then of course, keeping all of my wetland research in the Everglades. One of my favorite things though was really working with the pathologists because they were like crazy about all these tree diseases that apparently like had just not made its mark on me just yet. And so being in the Rocky Mountains, this is around the time where bark beetle was a big thing and everyone was freaking out because there were so many forests being transformed into ghost forests where there was just like so much standing dead forests for a number of different reasons. One of them were because of bark beetles. Another major reason is because of all of these high intensity wildfires. But it was during this time that I really decided like, you know, disturbances are my thing. I love them. They tell you a lot about a system, it forces change, and then you have this really great opportunity to measure exactly how responsive systems will be to those events and then how they're going to recover from them. But one thing I did learn is that the West is not like the Southeast. When something happens in the Southeast, you better get out there quick. The evidence will be gone quickly. In the West, they were showing me locations that had burned like 10 years ago, and it still looked like they had burned, all the scars were on the landscape. And so recognizing that things happen on very, very different scales was really interesting to me. Because when we were doing this work to look at what's gonna happen with species distributions, I thought like, well, how much could they change? Like, really, why are we doing this? How much could you really expect a species distribution to change in the next 50 to 100 years? And then I realized, oh yeah, well, if we keep going at this rate with these disturbances, we should expect very serious changes in species distributions because disturbances are really good opportunities to shake it up. And shake up is what is really happening, especially in these high elevation forests that are seeing all these fires, all these disease outbreaks. And so it was really timely to start thinking about, well, what species would do well where? And that was because after really large wildfires, to prevent landslides, the Forest Service is gonna go in and they're going to do some planting. And they have to decide, what should we plant? It doesn't make sense to plant something that's not gonna do well under current and future conditions. And so we were trying to figure out, well, which species will do better at which elevations and under what conditions so that they can decide what they're going to do in response to events that's gonna require them to do some planting. And so these species distribution models was a really great way to start thinking about how to make these decisions. Although now I'm starting to think, well, not starting to think, I know for sure I would do this quite differently. When we were doing these species distribution models in the olden days, we really focused just on climatic conditions and topography. But now it's possible for you to determine how well these species are responding. And so if I were to do this again, I would definitely reject my paper and say, hey, go get some evidence of how the species are responding and take that into account with my species distribution modeling to make it more aligned with how the species are going to respond and not make the assumption that the climate should dictate what should be where. Climate interacting with responses. Okay. I also did quite a bit of work looking at drought effects. Some of this is off of some of the work that we started looking into in our synthesis working group, just looking at drought, and I wanted to be able to detect mortality and see if I could actually estimate where mortality would be better or worse. And this was largely based off of a conversation that I had with some tower managers who were like, yeah, it's all over the place and it's splotchy. I wonder if you can get a feel for which areas will be more or less likely if you can tie in information about water use efficiency that you're getting from the towers, looking at ET and primary productivity. And so we created this product. It worked okay, like, you know, theoretically it made sense, but some of the estimates of mortality, like the trees just were more resilient than we would have otherwise estimated. And this project didn't go further into figuring out why that was, but it still like haunts me a little bit. I want to know why. Why are they so resilient? I said you should die. I also did a lot of work in fires. And so the way that that works in the Rockies was, it's not like the Southeast where like you have a fire, like that thing is gonna recover really quickly. There's gonna be some vegetation in a season or two and it's gonna be good. But in the West, like, nah, they had some problems. When they'd have these high severity fires, they would have these whole landscapes that would stay non-vegetated for a really long time. And so they had to make decisions like, what are you gonna do? And we used to have these conversations about like, well, maybe you should do nothing. What would be the cost of doing nothing? And then we started like, oh, we can estimate what would be the cost of doing nothing, no problem. We could say, how long would it take for these systems to recover? We could also say, based off of where these systems are, what's the likelihood that invasive species will get introduced? We can start using this information because we have it in space to understand what the cost could be and then decide what is the best solution. And so a lot of the work that I did when I was with the Forest Service was to get after some of these questions. What if we do nothing? What if invasive species come in because that's a real threat? What would happen in terms of carbon dynamics, even though in these days, we still didn't care about carbon that much, but still, we thought about it. And so I did that work up until the change in the administration, and then I decided I should try my hand at academia because, of course, you only have a short amount of time from the time you graduate to decide whether or not you are going to give it a shot in academia or if you're going to stay in the federal system. And so I thought, this is my shot. And so I moved on to Florida International University, which was actually the location associated with where I did a lot of my PhD work in the Everglades, because Florida International University has the Florida Coastal Everglades LTER. And so during this phase of my life, I really started getting into network science, and that was for two reasons. One, because I actually do believe in like the dream of network science, where you have some of these institutions that have all the resources. They have all the resources, they get to, they have a lot of grants, they have a lot of state funding, and they collect all this data. And just because they have the opportunity to collect all this data, should they be the only ones to do research? Like, that's boo-boo. And so I thought, I want to go to an institution that not only collects information, but they put a lot of effort into making that information available for everyone to use. And that means that everyone could be a scientist. Yes, you need some training, but you could be a scientist because the information isn't held by individual labs. This is where I really got on my high horse about open data and open resources. And I was like, I want to be a part of a program that is really working towards making information available to everyone. And I really got into the Florida Coastal Everglades LTER, which was really great. I returned to my original tower sites where I was like, all right, I got a few more problems that I need to work out before I can start spatializing my models. I needed to figure out why exactly the systems were responding the way that they were when hydrology was changing. Is it just a physical process that the water is blocking these exchange rates, or is it changes in species activity? So those were the two ideas that were floating around at the time. And so we did a number of studies to figure out it's a little bit of both, but mostly it's changes in species activity that is then reflected in the flux rates. And so that was really important for us to figure out, because it then told us that actually, if we're going to try to spatialize models, we're going to have really good representation of species composition. I was not excited about this finding, but we put a lot of effort into doing these high resolution maps in the Everglades, and that was the result of that. And then I also needed to understand, well, how much of the carbon that is moving through the system is moving through horizontally, because up until this point, we made crazy assumptions that most of the flux and exchange rates was happening vertically, so we were capturing it with the tower. If you're a tower person, you believe that. You're like, it's going this way, and that's the only way that matters. Like, yeah. And then when you started measuring it this way, we were like, oh. Why is this way as big as this way? we got some problems here. So this means not only do we have to capture the landscape in high resolution in terms of the species composition, but now we have to capture how much water is moving through each cell of the landscape to make a realistic carbon model. Like, we cannot get around this idea that you got just as much carbon going this way as this way. And so it made us put a lot of focus into getting this. And so the next phase of the Florida Coastal Everglades LTER proposal that we put into NSF was all based off of getting this, because for years we said, ignore it, ignore it, ignore it. And then we ate our words and we wrote a proposal and said, we can't ignore it. Look at this paper. And so that's what we're working on now in the Everglades, while trying to understand how the intensification of inundation shifts influences it at the same time, because we have to get all of this right before we can spatialize our carbon models and expect them to be good. We're also looking at other types of extreme events that we know have a pretty big impact on these systems. And for here, I know it's kind of a joke that the Everglades gets these low temperature events, but we call them low temperature, not freezing, because they're not freezing. But there are low temperature events, and it takes a hit along the coastline. And so because of it, we do have to consider what the frequency of these extreme events that they're happening throughout the season, because these extreme events are associated with diebacks along the coastline and mangroves, and the mangroves are actually our high performers in terms of carbon capture. They're also really important in terms of landscape stability, and so they're the reason why we're not losing the coastline in South Florida. And so this is a major part of our work that we have to consider when making those spatialized models as well. How many cold events are we gonna have? And what's really interesting about there is that, like, the cold events, it depends on where you are in the landscape, if you even experience it. Because if you're inundated and you're in the middle, even though it's a cold event, you don't experience it as a cold event. Along the coast, where the water levels are lower, they experience everything that happens. And so you start to see these responses that are associated with the microclimate. And so we also realize now we have to get microclimate gridded climate data. Great. That is on top of it. But still, we move forward. And so right now, the Florida Coastal Everglades is really focused on getting that horizontal movement of carbon. We're getting the high resolution gridded climate data for that region, because we have to get these microclimates right. And we're also working on mapping the carbon in space. And so there's a number of campaigns, including the Blue Flux campaign, that's flying, that's recording carbon fluxes on aircraft so that we can get both the spatial and temporal aspects at the same time. And so future, I will have your spatialized maps of carbon in the Everglades, but it's something that we continue to work on. I decided to move my lab to Yale in 2022, and with that move, we made a pretty large focus, not just on working on regional carbon studies, but also thinking about what's happening globally. And so the Flux network is really interesting because we have these really high resolution areas temporally of what's happening in terms of carbon dynamics, but it doesn't allow us to escape the fact that we do comparisons between towers to try to get at what's happening spatially and to come up with approaches to understanding systems in space. And so this is where we move back in that time for time substitutions, but really focus on what's happening in these natural systems, but not just wetlands, natural systems in general. And so my lab, we focus on carbon sequestration, potential of different ecosystems. We look at the effects of pests and pathogens. We look at coastal ecosystems and how are ecosystems recovering from fire. We take all of this information from these tower networks, and by doing the comparison of the towers in space and in time, we're able to create these spatial extrapolations of what we think the budgets are. We recognize that these spatial extrapolations, they're like, fortune tells what we think might be happening at these systems, but our ability to make very accurate estimates is completely based on whether or not we are capturing all the major processes that are driving the carbon dynamics. And so I went through like 10 different studies in the Everglades that we did in order for us to make the list of what has to be in our final model for it to be more accurate. But now we're trying to do this for the entire globe, so just keep your expectations low in terms of the accuracy, because there's just no way you can maintain all of that spatial accuracy with these towers, with the number of towers that we have. And we know that for sure because we've done a number of studies to say like, okay, Sparkle has high hopes. She wants to take all of the towers that are measuring methane and be able to upscale it and come up with a budget that's based on measured data instead of using process-based models where we say, we think these processes are driving it, now go make me an estimate. The problem is, when I look at just coming up with a model for the US, if I just look at the data and what's available, the data says, Sparkle, stop, you don't have enough information to do this. And I tried to do it, and my estimates were way off compared to the process-based model, but I stand by my estimates. I don't know if I'm wrong or if they're wrong, they can be wrong, but we don't know the answer. And because of it, we've been really trying to focus on, well, what can we do to get at what the answer might be? And it's currently clear that we are still reliant on the process-based models while we try to build these networks. And you might ask yourself, how important is this information? I think it's pretty important, mostly because everybody's screaming net zero, everybody. We're gonna get to net zero. We're gonna be at net zero by 2025. That's like now. The problem is the idea of net zero could be a little bit questionable, but the way we talk about it now, net zero is the idea that we're gonna cut our emissions to a level that can be absorbed by nature. So that means that first we got to figure out what can be absorbed by nature. We know clearly it's not what we're doing now because the atmospheric concentration, where they're just accumulating all this carbon. But we have to get at this idea of like, what can systems offset? And if the systems can't offset it, what are we going to use to remove that additional carbon? And so right now, when we think about natural carbon credits in the market, we have this idea that if we emit a certain amount of carbon, then we should go look for that same amount of carbon uptake in systems. And if we do that, we're going to get to net zero. And I said, that doesn't make any sense. Is all that carbon available in natural systems? Even if the system takes up that amount of carbon, is it available to offset our emissions? And so I said, okay, the first way to get at this idea is you got to think about the other greenhouse gases that are going to be emitted from systems as carbon is going to be taken up. And so we know that there's going to be methane and there's going to be N2O gas. But if we start off with just thinking about methane, does the methane that's being emitted, how much of the CO2 that's being captured would need to offset that methane emission? That was what I questioned in this idea of net zero. And so we think that we have a pretty good idea of how much carbon is captured through primary productivity into these ecosystems. And currently right now, that's what we're using as our estimates for how many credits each location should be worth. I question that if that is true, then most ecosystems should end up in our second box here, which is the light green box, where you have ecosystems that can take up enough carbon as CO2 that they are going to be a net sink for CO2. But even if they emit a little bit of methane, the methane shouldn't be too much, and they can offset that. Or they should be in the third box, the dark green, our good box, where they're essentially taking up CO2 and also taking up methane. But if that's not true, then most of these systems should not be considered for carbon credits. And so the question is, how much of these locations globally for natural areas even end up in the two boxes that we can even consider? To do this, I take all of the eddy covariance data that's available globally, and a lot of this information was already produced in a global upscaling in a product that included also remote sensing products to get at what's called FluxComp. And so this is a global upscaling of CO2 fluxes that I use that are representative of measurements of CO2 exchange rates from natural areas. Now, when I decide to, if I do a comparison of CO2, now I need a source for methane data, and I already told you, we ain't got enough towers. So I have to use another source of information. And so still, process-based models are the best thing that we can go. So I went through all the process-based models that make estimates globally, and I pulled out the models that do uptake of methane in upland ecosystems so that I can then look at the ratio of CO2 uptake to methane emissions to see what my offset rate is gonna be. And so I do this not only based off of the FluxCom CO2 product and the process-based model comparison, but I also go through the literature for every single location that has provided annual budget of CO2 and methane to say, what's that ratio? And when I do this, I have to adjust the methane for the warming potential of CO2. And so the methane for the sustained warming potential is 45 times greater than CO2. And so for those really small methane emissions, I have to multiply them times 45 to figure out what's the CO2 equivalence. And then first, I do this for everything that I find in the literature, which is where I found one, I separated upland and inundated ecosystems because we already know those inundated ecosystems are going to be a pretty big source of methane. But when I do those comparisons, I can see that the inundated ecosystems have much more methane that's being emitted. It's like 80% greater than upland. That's not shocking. That's what we expect. Between the upland and inundated, most of those ecosystems are falling in the second box, which is where we wanted. But for inundated ecosystems, even though they're falling in the second box, their release of methane is too great for them to be considered for carbon solutions. And so the vast majority of inundated systems fell out and would not actually have any carbon uptake available to be used for carbon credits. And then for inundated ecosystems, they could go either way, but most of them fell on the other side. And so they were still net sinks for CO2 together. When I do this globally for the entire products, using the FluxCom and the process-based model where I can make an estimate for every single natural location, I see very similar patterns, except for I lose a lot more upland ecosystems that are not on the right side of the line, meaning that they spend enough time with sufficient moisture conditions in their soils to still be sources of methane to the atmosphere. And so I am going to lose quite a bit of upland ecosystems to methane emissions. And I still lose quite a bit of inundated, but that's what we would expect from the beginning. And then when I take a global average, it comes out using the reanalysis, so the FluxCom and the model base, that if you want to use natural systems as a carbon solution, you should just write off half of the carbon as being necessary to offset just methane. Right, so this essentially means that if you're going to make claims of getting to net zero, you need to buy twice the credits for your emissions for it actually to have the same atmospheric impact on average with these estimates. And so, yes, these estimates have a lot of gray area in them. The fact that these products were not even designed to do this, but this is actually our best estimate for what these rates are currently. And so until that changes, if you want to claim net zero, you need to buy double your carbon credits. You also have to question whether or not these carbon exchange patterns are even consistent in time. Because what we have seen is that if we go back from 2000 all the way up to 2020, carbon exchange patterns, about 10% or 11% of locations, their carbon exchange patterns are changing, so it's not consistent. You need to know hydrology at a pretty high resolution in order to understand how consistent these patterns are and how many systems are switching in terms of how much methane they're producing, and a whole lot of areas, how much CO2 they're sequestering annually is changing pretty dramatically. And so you have systems that are flopping or crossing an axis, which means that a lot of disturbances are leading to the loss or instability of carbon exchange patterns. And so that's something that we really do have to consider for natural carbon credits, because this carbon is not stable over time. And so large parts of the world are stable, that's true. Most of them, surprisingly, are in the tropics. And so just 57% of natural areas are showing stable carbon exchange patterns, but a large percentage are not. And so we have to be concerned about whether areas that are being secured for carbon credits are actually have stable carbon, or is that carbon just going to be lost relatively quickly? And so we have been going through all the biomes, trying to figure out which ones have the highest probability. Tropical biome, surprisingly, they had a lot of stable carbon that was not being lost to disturbances, but I should say that these kind of estimates can take into consideration for certain types of disturbances and not others. This does not take into consideration if you have large fires that are moving through the landscape. This is really just climate-driven disturbances that would be captured in this type of analysis, and so big caveat. And so can carbon captured in natural systems offset anthropogenic emissions? They can, but not as much as we think and not as much as we're accounting for. And so if we want our carbon credit system to actually align with atmospheric impact, we have to do better accounting. And this wasn't even good accounting. This was just better than what they're doing. But the reality is that we still have pretty large data limitations when it comes to understanding methane dynamics. But the best approach we can take now suggests that double the credits is required to get to net zero. What's the future of geospatial analytics in my field? I would say one of the most important things to realize in understanding global carbon dynamics is that the measurements happen at very different scales. Atmospheric people are looking at the atmosphere and saying how much change they see. Remote sensing people are looking at the surface and saying how much change they're seeing. Flux people are saying how much exchange rates are changing. But we really need approaches that are using information from all these levels at the same time to feed back in order to get the best estimates. And so we have groups that are working on knowledge-guided machine learning, where you take information that you're learning at these different scales and try to get that to a global estimate that is responding to all the information at all the scales at the same time to come up with the best estimate. And that's where I think geospatial is going, not just in representing things better in space, but not just horizontal space of the surface, but also vertical space. And so we're going to be going in all these different dimensions, which is really fun and exciting and difficult. And a lot of this work is happening through synthesis working groups. And so there are 2 working groups that are working on either increasing methane exchange rate measurements from different systems, or the knowledge-guided machine learning. And so if any of you are interested in working at any of the synthesis centers, please take a look at NCs or ESOL. They have really great opportunities to get engaged in these different groups and learn how to do these calculations. And if you're interested in proposing any new synthesis working groups, I'm happy to help you come up with that. And so all of the work in this presentation was supported by my colleagues, collaborators, and people in my lab. And so I just want to be clear, I am representing a huge group of us. And so if you have any questions, though, I am happy to take them. I feel like I told you all my whole life.
I have a very minor question, just concerning your early work. What's a monolith? Is that like a soil core, like a profile?
It's kind of like a giant soil core, except we're trying to harvest all the vegetation in addition to the soil with intact roots. And so because we want to run an experiment on these little ecosystems, we need to harvest the ecosystem together intact. And then we put them in containers, keep them alive for a long time before we're convinced we're not going to kill them with our experiment. And then we'll start an experiment, but it's essentially where we try to harvest everything intact altogether.
So it sounds like you've done a lot of work with both like field work and doing like actual experiments, and then doing like computer work with like modeling and remote sensing. So how have those 2 different types of experiences informed your understanding of the different systems that you've worked with?
Yeah, A lot of people get to choose very narrowly what their specialization is gonna be, but I was like one of those people, I was like, I refuse to choose, I need my options to be open all the time. And so I kind of committed to learning whatever I needed to do to answer whatever question came up. And in any case, like if disturbance wasn't going my way, no disturbances were happening, oh, I'll make it happen. You know, I don't know, maybe I have a God complex or something, but I will do whatever it takes to get the measurement that I need, and if I can't rely on natural processes to give me a drought, then I will harvest everything and I will make a drought. And so that's kind of the mentality that I took into the development of my research program. Not that it's always required, because you could also just collaborate with other people, that's probably better. You can probably just collaborate with other people and collect the information you need from where you need it. But oftentimes, like, I will just make it happen. And it was great because, you know, you get sick of being in the lab all the time, so then you get to go outside. You get sick of being outside, then you come on inside. And so I like being flexible.
With your most recent work, that was looking at like inundated areas versus the upland areas, and thinking about like climate change and the more extreme events and sea level rise, where we're having more of this flooding and inundation that's happening. Like I know I know that this work in climate science is often like it changes. What's happening is changing so fast, but the science often takes a long time. So one, I guess, like what years were the work that you've been doing with this? And then like how are you all taking into account that change? And I guess I'm thinking about like maybe the potential for like more inundation to happen like over time as land areas shift.
Yeah, so when it comes to like making the future scenarios that we're gonna run with, we try to really think about like everything that can happen. And so we do lean heavily on what's projected to happen in an area, but we usually take those scenarios a bit beyond that, because I mean, we all know like these projections that we make, none of it is real. And so if we want to know like all the possible futures, we should be using scenarios that are expansive enough to actually include the possible futures. And so we do that. Even if everything says for a particular region, it's just gonna get wetter and warmer, we will do the wetter and warmer scenarios, but we're also going to do the wetter and drier, that's not possible. The wetter and cooler, you know, like you try to get all the possible futures in your projection so that even if you show a particular projection line that's aligned with what is expected of the region, I like to also show, let me show you what happens if those projections are wrong, and put that into the uncertainty estimate and show what a different future might look like. Because the reality is like, one, I'm not actually trying to be right. There's no way I can be. And two, the point is to like really understand what's possible so that you can take that into consideration for whatever decisions you have to make. And so I kind of let go a long time of the idea that like, oh, my projections have to be good. They have to really be right and represent what's going to happen. And I started to think, no, my projection should represent what is possible. And you present it that way, and then that relieves you from ever feeling like it really has to be right. It's not possible to be right, because the whole point of creating a model is that it is excluding processes, and because you can't include everything means that you have to be wrong. You just hope that you included the most important things to understand the directions that this could go in.
Okay, I think it's very interesting that you show inundation has shifted wetlands to CO2 sink to its emissions. So we found, or we argue in our recent paper, that like wetland emissions for methane over the past 3 years due to inundation has led to this global methane surge, and we found very good correlation between inundation data and also wetland methane emissions, especially over wet tropic regions. I'm an atmospheric scientist, so my first question for you is that like from a biological or ecosystem perspective, like is there
any explanation that why this could be increased that much that cannot be captured by the process-based wetland model? And second, I'm so glad that you mentioned about like using machine learning to integrate remote sensing data and those process-based model. I'm curious if you have any insights into how to interpret this.
Yeah, you know, these, with the Everglades wetlands in general, they're a little bit different than what your expectations are, and that is because of the legacy of land management in the Everglades region, right? And so Florida, the whole reason why so many people live in South Florida is because they drain that thing. It is been underwater. Everyone talks about sea level rise, all the flooding. I was like, it flooded my whole life in Florida because the whole thing is supposed to be underwater like all the time. And so they flooded all of this area. And then around the 1940s, 50s, they started to pay for their choices. And so the same patterns that we see that happened in California with wildfires, that was happening in Florida. Everything was burning up all over the place. It wasn't just trees and vegetation that was burning, it was peat. So the ground was on fire. In response to them realizing like, oh, you gotta manage things appropriately if you don't wanna die in a fire, they started the South Florida Water Management District, which was like, all right, well, maybe we need to innovate some of these areas because we have exposed all of this carbon that's just sitting there. You dried it out, it can burn at any time. So now they started to move towards the natural resource management that was focused on fixing the hydrology that they screwed up so that a lot of people can live in South Florida because the weather is good. It is good. I live there, I'm from there, I love it. The weather's good. And so, in response to fixing this hydrology where now they're trying to inundate all these areas, some of these areas had already changed their species composition in a way that they were more upland than wetland ecosystems. And if you flood an upland ecosystem, you're gonna reduce the productivity of those areas because you have a lot of species there that do not thrive in inundation. And so the Everglades, in the efforts of getting the carbon right for large parts of the landscape, that's gonna come at a carbon cost for at least a period of time until the species composition can respond accordingly. And so some of the responses that we see in terms of what happens to the carbon exchange pattern is because of that. There are a lot of species in that landscape that should not be there. And so you're seeing those species turn over and that influences the carbon budget. But you also see these ecosystems are like almost zero in terms of their net exchange. And so any shift in species activity will flip you from a sink to a source, but it's always really small. And so they're always jumping on either side. And so when I say it shifts from a sink to a source, yeah, that happens real easily when you're at zero. But also the exchange patterns are responding to a period of time where the landscape was shifting towards upland dominant species, and now that they're being inundated again, their response is representative of that. Yeah, and so that's part of it. When it comes to the process-based models, I mean, I love process-based models because it's like, well, if you know what's happening, then you should be able to build a model that can replicate what you think is happening and the measurements, and if you get those two things to align, you should feel somewhat confident that you understand what's happening. And what we found with process-based models, like, yeah, that clearly we are missing some things. And so that's great to know. But even in the effort of trying to see how to make them align, what kind of changes would you have to make to that model? It can help us really understand what are we missing? What would we need to consider at a large scale? And so it's really exciting to do these comparison of measurements and models to help fill the gaps in our knowledge, but also to make us realize what is important at different scales when you're trying to create models that work over large areas.
One more.
Sure.
It seems in a sense that you're pursuing a moving target.
Yeah.
An ever-changing environment. Yet you have worked in academia, you have worked with practitioners.
Mhm.
How do you compromise it too? Here we have practitioners trying to operationalize things. You said it yourself, you can buy credits for a location. That's not a ever-changing value for that location.
Mhm.
Credits are fixed for a specific, I'm assuming, extension of land. Where do you see then the future moving towards? An area that in the same way you're ever estimating better and better and better, what's the budget? can you also see a future where credits will reach that same vision where we're ever adapting what quote-unquote allocation can be valued for or credited for?
Yeah, so I actually don't think that the problem is the credit.
Okay,
I feel like the problem is the interpretation of the credit. And this idea that people are putting forward like, oh, I'm gonna get to net zero by buying credits to offset. Like, no, you can buy credits, but how many credits should you buy? Right, because you're gonna have to do something to fix what a location might be worth. But if you're trying to claim a certain status, I think that that's where you need to really do better science before you should ever get an emblem saying that you are net zero. Because it's not the credit, the definition of the credit never says that it has to align with atmospheric impact. But net zero has a definition that says it aligns. And that's where I kind of throw all of my side eye to this idea of claiming that you're net zero. If you haven't done the math, you don't know that to be true. And that is where I would actually say, like, if some organization wants to claim that they reached a status, the science has to be done to confirm it. Because it's unlikely to be true if you're going based on what's happening now, where they're just buying an equal amount of credits, saying now I'm at net zero. It's like, no, net zero is about atmospheric impact, not how many credits you bought. And that's where I would say, like, that should be better evaluated before it's claimed. I don't think they're gonna change the credits. I don't see it happening.
Oh, well, let's think about it.
Yes, please join us down the hall for refreshments and stay tuned.
Stay tuned for the GIS week schedule coming soon to your emails next week. There will be everything, lunches, workshops. So please come, lots of food.